The room fell silent. All eyes were on Captain Olivia Carter as she stood in the middle of Atlantic Horizon Airlines headquarters, facing down the executives who thought they could silence her. "You don't understand," Michael Reynolds, the operations director, sneered. "You don't win this fight. You're one pilot, one employee. We are an entire corporation." Olivia held up a flash drive, her grip steady, her voice unwavering. "And this," she said, "is everything." The board members exchanged nervous glances. "Every falsified maintenance report, every time you cut corners, every cover-up," she continued, stepping closer. "I have testimonies, documents, enough proof to ground this airline for good." "You have no idea what you're doing," Reynolds hissed, his face pale now. Olivia smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. And in about 5 minutes, so will the FAA, and the press, and every single passenger who ever stepped onto one of your planes." The color drained from his face, because it was already too late. "Before we get into today's story, I just want to take a second to say thank you for being here. Your time is valuable, and I truly appreciate you choosing to spend it here with me. This one's going to hit deep, and I know some of you will relate to it. So stick around, and if this resonates with you, comment the number 1. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, let's get into it. Captain Olivia Carter walked through the bustling corridors of JFK International Airport, her polished black boots clicking against the sleek tile floor. The early morning rush was already in full swing, with travelers dragging wheeled suitcases behind them, clutching overpriced airport coffee, and scanning departure boards. Olivia moved with quiet confidence, her crisp navy uniform immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on her shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Today was supposed to be a milestone, a moment she had worked toward her entire life. At 34 years old, she was stepping into her new role as senior captain at Atlantic Horizon Airlines, one of the country's largest and most prestigious carriers. But even as she strode toward the crew lounge, she could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the subtle shifts in energy as people registered who she was. It was always the same, a pause in conversation, a slight hesitation before someone acknowledged her presence. Not outright hostility, no, that would be too obvious. Instead, it was a quiet, insidious skepticism, as though her very existence in this space was something to be questioned. She had learned to recognize the quick, assessing glances, the barely concealed disbelief. A black woman in the captain's seat was still an anomaly. The statistics didn't lie. Less than 1% of all commercial airline pilots were black women, and fewer still had earned the rank of senior captain. Olivia knew that every step she took through these halls was a statement, a disruption of the status quo, whether she wanted it to be or not. But she was used to that. She had spent her entire career proving herself in an industry that had never been designed for her. Graduating at the top of her class from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, she had gone on to serve as a military transport pilot in the Air Force, flying high-risk missions in some of the most dangerous airspaces in the world. She had maneuvered massive aircraft through sandstorms in the Middle East, landed on remote airstrips under night vision, and carried wounded soldiers to safety. Yet, despite her extensive experience, she had encountered the same skepticism when she transitioned to commercial aviation. Passengers who did double takes when they heard her voice over the intercom, colleagues who made offhanded comments about how impressive it was that she had made it this far, executives who looked past her in meetings, as if waiting for someone else to speak. She had learned not to let it shake her. The cockpit was where she was at home, where her skill spoke louder than any doubt that others might hold. Still, as she neared the entrance to the crew lounge, she adjusted her grip on her flight case, rolling her shoulders back. Today was her first official flight as senior captain, and she refused to let anything or anyone dull the pride she felt in earning this role. Pushing open the door, she stepped into the lounge, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the low murmur of early morning conversations. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the clusters of pilots and flight attendants reviewing flight plans, some scrolling through their phones, Others engaged in quiet discussions. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that today would be just another day, another routine flight. But then the inevitable pause came. A fraction of a second where conversations stilled, heads turned, and she felt it. The momentary disruption she caused simply by existing in this space. She ignored it. She had long since stopped wasting energy on their doubts. She walked toward the coffee station, her movements unhurried, her expression composed. As she poured herself a cup, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished steel of the coffee machine. Strong, determined, unshaken. Her father's words echoed in her mind, the ones he had repeated since she was a child. You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. It had been unfair then, it was unfair now. But she had done it anyway. And today, nothing was going to stop her from flying. Olivia took a steady breath as she sipped her coffee, letting the rich bitterness ground her. The silence in the lounge wasn't absolute, but it was noticeable. Conversations had dipped, eyes had flickered toward her before looking away just as quickly. She wasn't new to this reaction. It happened in subtle ways, in the way some pilots hesitated before acknowledging her, in the way a few leaned in closer to whisper to their colleagues, their expressions unreadable. She ignored it, just as she always had, focusing instead on the checklist in her mind. Today's flight was routine. New York to Los Angeles, a route she had flown dozens of times. Smooth air over the Midwest, slight crosswinds near the Rockies, nothing out of the ordinary. She had studied the flight plan the night before, double-checked weather conditions, and reviewed every procedural update. She was ready. A voice broke through the quiet hum of the room, sharp and deliberate. "Captain Carter, we need you to wait outside." The words weren't particularly loud, but they might as well have been shouted. Olivia turned, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup as she met the gaze of Michael Reynolds, Atlantic Horizon's operations director. He stood in the doorway, posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral but unmistakably firm. Behind him, a few pilots exchanged quick glances, some feigning disinterest, others looking on with thinly veiled curiosity. The message in his words was clear. This wasn't a request. Olivia's jaw tightened. She set her coffee down, smoothing the front of her uniform as she faced him. "Is there a problem, sir?" Her voice was steady, professional, giving him the benefit of the doubt. Reynolds didn't hesitate. "There's been a change in assignment. Captain Whitman will be taking flight AH-231 to LAX. We need you to wait outside while we handle the reassignment." For a split second, Olivia thought she had misheard him. She blinked, her mind instantly calculating the absurdity of the statement. She had been scheduled for this flight for weeks. She had already completed the required briefings. She had memorized every detail of today's route, and she had confirmed with crew dispatch just this morning. There was no legitimate reason for this sudden reassignment. Jonathan Whitman, standing just behind Reynolds, had the audacity to smirk. He was young, maybe early 30s, with the self-assured ease of someone who had never had to question whether he belonged. Olivia knew his record, decent but nowhere near her level of experience. He had barely half her flight hours and had been promoted far more quickly than his skill justified. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "I was assigned to this flight. I've already reviewed today's conditions and confirmed everything with operations." Reynolds exhaled, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "It's a procedural decision, Captain Carter. We need a more experienced captain handling today's flight." The words hit like a slap. A more experienced captain. There was no one in this room more qualified than she was. The sheer audacity of the lie almost made her laugh. Almost. Her fingers curled into her palm. "With all due respect, sir, I have over 12,000 flight hours, including high-risk military operations. I've flown this exact route more times than I can count. I'd like a specific reason for this change." Whitman let out a quiet scoff, but Reynolds gave him a warning glance before turning back to Olivia. "It's not personal," he said, his voice suddenly softer, condescending in a way that made her skin crawl. "We just want to make sure everything runs smoothly." Everything in her told her to fight harder, to demand answers, to call out the blatant discrimination happening right in front of everyone. But she knew how this game worked. If she pushed too hard, she'd be labeled difficult. If she accepted it silently, they would take it as permission to do it again. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every pilot, every flight attendant, every staff member present had heard what just happened. They all knew exactly what this was, and not a single one of them spoke up. She shifted her gaze to Ethan Park, her assigned first officer for today's flight. He was standing a few feet away, stiff and uneasy, his dark brown eyes darting between her and Reynolds. Ethan was young, ambitious, one of the few Asian American pilots in the company, and he knew what was happening. His expression screamed it. This isn't fair, this isn't right. But he didn't say a word. Olivia gave him a look that asked the question anyway. Are you really going to just stand there? Ethan hesitated. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to say something, but then he cast a glance toward Reynolds and stopped himself. The moment stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he looked away. A dull ache settled in Olivia's chest, a familiar kind of disappointment. She had seen this before. Good people, silent when it mattered most. She let the quiet drag on for another few seconds, forcing Reynolds to hold her gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached for the flight plan she had printed out that morning, set it on the counter, and nodded once. Understood. Reynolds gave a tight smile, almost relieved that she wasn't going to fight him. Good. We'll let you know where you'll reassign shortly. She turned and walked out, her movements controlled, refusing to let them see anything but absolute composure. But as she stepped into the hallway out of their sight, she exhaled, her fists tightening at her sides. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Olivia sat in the dimly lit crew lounge, gripping the reassignment notice in her hand. Flight 422 to Denver. Not as the captain, not even as the first officer, but as an observer. A training flight. The insult burned deep. She had spent years proving herself, accumulating more experience than most of the pilots in this company, only to be reduced to shadowing another captain as if she were some fresh recruit out of flight school. It was calculated, deliberate, meant to humiliate her. And when she saw the name of the assigned captain, her stomach twisted. Harold Weston. The name was infamous in aviation circles, not for his skill, but for his outdated, bigoted views. A man who had openly opposed diversity initiatives, who had once been overheard calling a female pilot a liability in heels, who had built a reputation on making sure people like Olivia never made it past the glass ceiling he so comfortably rested under. By the time she reached the gate, the pre-flight checks were already underway. Weston stood near the cockpit, arms crossed over his chest, chatting with Peter Lawson, the first officer for the flight. The moment he saw Olivia, his expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. An immediate dismissal, a quiet decision that she wasn't worth acknowledging. She walked up, standing beside Peter, waiting for Weston to at least acknowledge her presence. He didn't. Instead, he turned to Peter with a smirk. "We ready to get this bird in the air, son?" Peter hesitated, glancing briefly at Olivia before nodding. "Yes, sir. Everything's set for departure." Weston grunted, still not looking at her. "Good. Let's get going. Don't want to keep passengers waiting." The audacity of it all was suffocating. Olivia had flown combat missions in the dead of night, had landed in hostile zones under fire, had guided aircraft through raging storms that sent lesser pilots into a panic. And yet here she was, standing beside a man who refused to acknowledge her existence, pretending she wasn't there simply because it was easier than admitting that she had earned her place in this cockpit. She refused to let it show. "Captain Weston," she said evenly, voice controlled, professional. He finally turned his head, raising an eyebrow as if he had just now noticed her standing there. "Oh, that's right. We've got an observer today," he said, the word dripping with condescension. Well, don't get in the way. We've got a system here and I like things done a certain way. Olivia kept her expression neutral. I'm here to observe company procedures, not interfere. Weston let out a short laugh. Right. Company procedures. He looked back at Peter, his tone taking on a forced casualness that was meant to be overheard. You know, back in my day, we didn't need all these diversity hires slowing things down. Just pilots who knew how to do the damn job. The words hit like a slap, sharp and cutting, designed to see if she would flinch. She didn't. Peter shifted uncomfortably beside her, his gaze flickering between the two of them, his hands tightening at his sides. He wanted to say something. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way he opened his mouth just slightly before thinking better of it. But in the end, he said nothing. Olivia had seen this 100 times before. The fear of speaking up, the internal calculation of whether it was worth the risk. Peter was young, still working his way up the ranks, and he knew that Weston had the power to make or break careers. He wasn't willing to throw himself into the fire for her. Weston, seeing no immediate pushback, continued as if she weren't standing right there. It's a different world now, though. Gotta make room for everyone, I suppose. Even if it means lowering the bar. Olivia's nails pressed into the palm of her hand. A lesser person would have snapped back, thrown his words right back in his face. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she just smiled. Calm, steady, unshaken. Funny, she said coolly. I was thinking the same thing about you. Peter inhaled sharply beside her, his eyes widening just a fraction. Weston's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he chuckled and shook his head. Cute, he muttered, turning back to his checklist. She had won this round, but she knew it wasn't over. This wasn't about one flight, one comment. This was about a culture, an ingrained belief that pilots like her didn't belong, that she would always be seen as an outsider, no matter how hard she worked. But if they thought she was going to bow her head and take it, they had severely underestimated her. The flight to Denver was uneventful, at least in the air. On the ground, it had been another story. Weston spent the entire flight ignoring her, his commentary laced with casual condescension, his instructions to Peter more like performances, as if Olivia weren't even in the cockpit. She endured it, storing away every word, every sideways glance, every moment that proved exactly what she already knew. That this wasn't about her ability, it was about keeping people like her in their place. But she had learned long ago that revenge wasn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about knowing things others didn't want you to know. After they landed in Denver, while Weston strolled off to chat with ground crew like a self-appointed king, Olivia requested access to the flight logs. It wasn't unusual, pilots reviewed them all the time. But she had a feeling, a small nagging instinct sharpened by years of knowing when something wasn't right. As she flipped through the log entries, her sharp eyes scanned the maintenance records. At first glance, everything seemed routine. Fuel reports, tire pressure checks, standard clearance stamps. But then, something stood out. An engine valve inspection was marked as completed yesterday. She frowned. That didn't make sense. Atlantic Horizon followed 48-hour rotation schedules for that particular check, which meant it wasn't due for another day. She flipped back 2 weeks. The same maintenance log entry, word for word. A copy-paste, and the mechanic's signature was different each time. She felt a slow burn creep up her spine. Either someone was getting lazy, or someone was covering something up. Olivia set the log down and exhaled, her fingers tightening over the laminated pages. If this was happening on one aircraft, how many others had the same discrepancies? She needed to find out. By the time she made her way down to the maintenance hangar, the air smelled thick with oil, rubber, and jet fuel, the low hum of machinery vibrating through the floor. The crew was moving efficiently, some working on refueling while others inspected landing gear. Most of them barely spared her a glance. Pilots rarely came down here unless there was an issue. She scanned the room until she spotted a man in grease-streaked coveralls checking a clipboard beside an open engine panel. Marcus Taylor. She recognized him from previous flights. Not friendly, but not hostile either. He was one of the senior mechanics, the kind of guy who had been around long enough to know how things worked, how rules could be bent without technically breaking them. She walked up, her voice steady. "Marcus." He glanced up, squinting at her before nodding. "Captain Carter, right? Didn't expect to see you down here." "Didn't expect to be here," she admitted, holding up the logbook. "But I saw something that didn't sit right with me." Marcus sighed, tucking his clipboard under his arm. "What are you looking for?" She flipped to the engine valve inspection record, pointing at the timestamp. "This says the inspection was completed yesterday, but when I checked back 2 weeks, it said the same thing. Down to the wording. Only the signatures are different." Marcus's expression barely changed, but she saw the way his fingers flexed slightly against the clipboard. "That's routine maintenance," he said, but his voice had a forced casualness to it. "Nothing out of the ordinary." "Except the engine check wasn't actually due until today," Olivia countered. "So why does it say it was done early? And why does it look like a carbon copy of the last one?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His jaw tensed, his eyes flickering toward the supervisors at the other end of the hangar. Then, voice lower, he said, "Let it go, Captain." Olivia's pulse quickened. "I can't do that. If maintenance reports are being falsified—" "They're not being falsified," Marcus interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're just adjusted sometimes. Flights have to stay on schedule, and if that means signing off on a few things a little early, it keeps the system moving." Her stomach turned. "That's not an adjustment, Marcus. That's negligence. If an engine fails because a check wasn't actually done—" "It don't fail," he said, but now he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. At least, not right away, and not enough to ground a flight. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "How many planes?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "How many have had logs altered?" Marcus hesitated. That moment of hesitation told her everything. "Marcus," she pressed, "you've been here 20 years. If something happens and you knew—" He exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not just me, Carter. It's company-wide. Why? They tell us to keep things moving, to use our best judgment, but judgment doesn't mean a damn thing when the guys upstairs are pushing deadlines. We're short-staffed, overworked, and they expect us to sign off on checks that should take hours in half the time. And if you push back too much, you get reassigned. Or worse, you violate company efficiency standards, and they find a reason to cut you loose." Olivia felt her jaw tighten. She had been so focused on the racism, on the way she was being systematically pushed down, that she hadn't even considered that the problem ran deeper than her own mistreatment. This wasn't just about her. This was criminal. "They can't keep getting away with this," she said, her voice deadly quiet. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "They already have, for years. Why do you think no one talks about it?" She stared at him, and for the first time, fear settled in her chest, not for herself, but for the passengers who stepped onto these planes every single day, trusting that safety wasn't something people were cutting corners on. "Are you willing to go on record?" she asked. His face darkened. "Are you crazy? I've got a family. I talk, I lose everything. But if you don't talk and something happens—" "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. But there was no real anger, only frustration, only exhaustion. He shook his head. "I need this job. And if you're smart, Captain, you'll stop asking questions before you end up out of one too." She should have been afraid. Maybe a small part of her was, but mostly, she felt something hotter, sharper. Rage. They thought she would just take it, that she would swallow the discrimination, the humiliation, and the knowledge that this company was playing Russian roulette with people's lives, just so they could keep their profits high and their schedules tight. They were wrong. She was done being quiet. Olivia sat in her hotel room, staring at the city lights outside the window, her mind still replaying every word Marcus had said. They already have, for years. The weight of it pressed down on her, but it didn't crush her. It sharpened her. She knew what she had to do. She just needed proof. As she reached for her phone to document her findings, a text notification popped up from an unknown number. "Watch your back. They're setting you up." Her breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the screen. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Someone, somewhere, knew what she was digging into, and they weren't going to let her get any further. She typed a reply. "Who is this? What are they planning?" The message remained unread. A cold chill ran down her spine, but fear wasn't an option. If they thought she would scare easily, they had underestimated her. The next morning, she arrived at JFK to find her schedule changed again. She had been reassigned. An overnight flight to Seattle. Flight AH-407. No explanation, no heads up, just a last-minute switch. She approached dispatch, forcing her voice to stay even. "Why was I reassigned?" The agent barely glanced up. "Orders from operations. Captain Whitman took your original route." Her jaw clenched. Jonathan Whitman, again. They were making sure she didn't fly the high-profile routes. But this wasn't about ego. Something about this felt wrong. She glanced at the maintenance logs for the aircraft. The same pattern of falsifications she had seen before. A signature that looked suspiciously like it had been copied from an earlier check. The landing gear system had been inspected yesterday, and yet she saw an identical entry from a week ago. If the system had truly been checked, why were the reports identical, word for word? Every nerve in her body screamed at her to walk away, but she couldn't. If she backed down now, she'd never get another chance to expose what was happening. She stepped onto the aircraft, scanning the cockpit. Ethan Park was already seated in the first officer's chair, looking up at her with a hesitant expression. He knew. "Captain," he greeted, his voice lower than usual. She sat down, strapping herself in, voice firm. "Did you see the maintenance logs for this aircraft?" "Did you see the maintenance logs for this aircraft?" Ethan's hands stilled over the flight checklist. He didn't look at her. "Yeah." And a long silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "We should be fine. We should be fine." She turned to him, and for the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. He had seen what she had seen. He had doubts, but he was too afraid to say it out loud. "You don't believe that," she said quietly. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the yoke. "What choice do we have?" The cabin crew finished their safety checks. The final boarding call went out. There was no turning back now. As the aircraft rolled onto the runway, Olivia exhaled slowly. She had flown thousands of takeoffs. She could do this in her sleep. But tonight, a gnawing unease sat in her chest. She pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared. The plane surged ahead. 30 seconds into takeoff, just as the nose lifted off the ground, a red warning light flashed across the control panel. Landing gear failure. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. Jesus! A second alarm blared, then a third. Olivia's hands moved on instinct, flicking switches, stabilizing the climb. "Tower, this is Atlantic Horizon 407. We have a landing gear malfunction, requesting immediate guidance," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Copy that, Oz 407, the tower responded. "Confirm malfunction. Do you have indication of full gear retraction?" Olivia scanned the instruments. The left side gear light was flickering between locked and unlocked. If it wasn't fully retracted, it could create drag and instability in flight. If it failed on landing, it could result in a collapse on the runway. She turned to Ethan. "We need to cycle the gear manually." He nodded, flipping the override switches. Nothing happened. The alarms kept screaming. From the cabin, the intercom crackled with the flight attendant's voice, trying to keep passengers calm. But Olivia knew what would happen next. Someone would check the in-flight tracker, realize the plane wasn't climbing normally, and panic would spread. "Captain," Ethan's voice was tight, "we need to turn back." "No, not yet." Olivia adjusted the throttle, trying to stabilize the aircraft. "Tower, we need to hold at 10,000 feet while we troubleshoot the issue." "Copy. H-407. Holding pattern. Approved." She glanced at Ethan. "Try the emergency extension. If we can't retract, we need to make sure we can deploy later." He flipped a switch. No response. A pit formed in her stomach. They were flying with no guaranteed landing gear. Minutes passed. The cockpit was a storm of alarms and flashing lights, but Olivia stayed calm, methodical. There had to be a solution. The aircraft was flyable, but landing? That was another story. "Tower, request emergency clearance for return to JFK," Olivia said, forcing her voice to remain level. "Stand by. H-407, the tower responded. A long silence. Then, "Captain Carter, the airline has denied emergency return. They are advising you to continue to Seattle." Olivia's blood ran ice cold. Ethan's head snapped toward her, his face pale. What? She knew exactly what this was. If she turned back, it would raise too many questions. A malfunction this severe would trigger an immediate FAA investigation. The airline didn't want that. "They're leaving us up here," Ethan whispered. She gritted her teeth. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She overrode company protocol, declaring an emergency landing. Tower immediately rerouted air traffic. The descent was brutal. She had to fight unstable yawing, the plane threatening to veer on approach. At 500 feet, she instructed the cabin crew, "Brace for impact." The wheels hit the runway. The left gear collapsed. The aircraft tilted dangerously, skidding sideways, metal shrieking against asphalt. Fire suppression systems deployed instantly. The entire plane shuddered to a stop. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then, the cabin erupted into cheers and sobs. Ethan exhaled shakily. "We're alive." Olivia stared ahead, her hands still gripping the controls, her breath coming fast and shallow. She had just saved 180 lives. And yet, when she stepped off the aircraft, Michael Reynolds was waiting for her. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't grateful. He looked furious. "You caused unnecessary panic," he snapped. "You overstepped protocol. You're done here, Captain Carter." Fired on the spot. She didn't react, didn't blink, because she had just realized something. They had sent her on this flight knowing it was compromised. They wanted to break her. Instead, she had exposed them. And now, she was going to burn them to the ground. Olivia sat in her car in the airport parking lot, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The echoes of the landing, the screech of metal against asphalt, the deafening silence before the eruption of terrified cries. Her body was still catching up with the reality that they had survived, that she had saved every single soul on that flight, and yet, standing on the tarmac, covered in sweat and exhaustion, she had been met not with gratitude, but with cold, calculated retaliation. Fired. On the spot. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she pulled out her phone, scrolling to the one person she trusted with what she was about to do. The phone rang once before a sharp, alert voice answered. "Liv?" Danielle Carter didn't waste time with pleasantries. As a high-powered attorney specializing in corporate fraud, she had the instincts of a predator and the courtroom presence of a hurricane. Olivia exhaled. "They tried to kill me tonight." There was a beat of silence. Then, "Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, Olivia detailed every lie, every falsified maintenance log, every manipulation, every risk they had forced onto innocent passengers, all to protect their bottom line. She told her about Marcus, the warning text, the maintenance irregularities, and finally, how they had deliberately refused to let her turn back, choosing corporate secrecy over human lives. By the time she finished, she could hear the quiet, controlled rage in Danielle's breath. "You have documents? Flight logs, maintenance records, timestamps, everything they've been covering up." Olivia's voice was razor sharp. "I need you to send it to the FAA. And the press." "Which press?" "All of them." Danielle didn't hesitate. "Give me 20 minutes." The call ended. Olivia sat in the stillness of her car, her heart pounding with a force that felt almost foreign. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about what they had done to her, how they had tried to humiliate her, push her out, silence her. This was about the hundreds of passengers who had unknowingly placed their trust in an airline that valued profit over their lives. She opened her email, attached the files, and sent them to Danielle. A single subject line: "Burn it all down." The next morning, the world woke up to chaos. Her phone vibrated relentlessly, the screen lighting up with news alerts and missed calls. She barely had to glance at them to know what was happening. Atlantic Horizon Airlines had just become the biggest corporate scandal in aviation history. Every major news outlet was running the story. Whistleblower pilot exposes corruption at Atlantic Horizon Airlines. FAA investigates allegations of falsified maintenance reports. Passengers unknowingly flew on unsafe planes. Company faces criminal negligence probe. And then, the one headline that made her inhale sharply: FAA gruns 40% of Atlantic Horizon's fleet immediate safety review underway. 40%. Nearly half their aircraft were deemed unfit to fly under emergency review. Flights were canceled nationwide. Travelers were stranded. Investors were panicking. She flicked to the stock market updates. Atlantic Horizon's value had dropped 38% overnight. The company was in free fall, and Olivia Carter had just brought them to their knees. Olivia walked through the towering glass doors of Atlantic Horizon's corporate headquarters, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor. The receptionist barely had time to look up before two suited security guards flanked her, their presence a silent message that she was not welcome here. She didn't acknowledge them. They weren't the ones she had come for. Michael Reynolds was waiting for her. She was led through the sleek modern hallways, past employees who either refused to make eye contact or stared with barely concealed curiosity. They all knew what was happening. They had seen the headlines, the breaking news, the growing storm that had knocked their once powerful airline off its feet. The conference room doors swung open, and she stepped inside. Reynolds was seated at the head of a long glass table, his posture rigid, his fingers laced together in forced control. Across from him sat two corporate lawyers, their crisp suits failing to hide the urgency in their eyes. A third chair had been left empty. For her. She didn't sit. "Captain Carter," Reynolds said, his voice tight, measured. "Thank you for coming in." She let the silence stretch, watching the way his fingers twitched against the table. He was trying to act like he was in control, but the dark circles under his eyes and the stiffness in his jaw betrayed him. He had spent the last 24 hours putting out fires, and they just kept spreading. "You're not here to thank me," Olivia said coolly. "So let's skip the pleasantries." Reynolds exhaled through his nose. He reached for a folder in front of him, sliding it toward her. "This is a severance package," he said. "A generous one. We're offering you a settlement, along with a confidentiality agreement." Olivia didn't touch it. The lawyer beside him leaned forward. "The package includes a substantial payout, enough to compensate for any lost wages or damages you may claim. In return, you'll sign an NDA stating that you will not disclose any further information regarding Atlantic Horizon's internal operations." Reynolds folded his hands again. "This is a one-time offer. You walk away with your career intact, and we put this all behind us." Olivia let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. You think I care about severance money? Reynolds' expression hardened. I think you care about flying. And there it was. The real threat. You'll never fly again, he continued. You think any airline is going to touch you after this? You went nuclear, Carter. You made yourself a liability. No company wants a pilot who runs to the press every time she doesn't like the way things are done. Olivia met his glare unmoved. He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. Take the deal. Sign the NDA. Otherwise, we'll make sure you never set foot in a cockpit again. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The room was so silent she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her bag and pulled out her own folder. A thick one, heavier than his. She slid it across the table. Reynolds frowned, but didn't touch it. I already sent this to the FA and 3 major news outlets, she said, her voice steady, sharp. Detailed maintenance logs, proof of falsified safety inspections, internal emails pressuring employees to ignore protocol, testimonies from crew members, ground staff, and whistleblowers you thought were too afraid to talk. Reynolds' face drained of color. The lawyer beside him picked up the folder, flipping through the pages. His hand visibly tightened around the documents. The other lawyer's jaw locked. Olivia leaned in slightly. You know what else is in there? Evidence that you knew about the faulty landing gear on flight AH-407 before we took off. Evidence that you denied an emergency return, knowing full well the plane might not survive the landing. Reynolds paled. How do you think that's going to look when the FAA concludes its investigation? She continued. Or when the families of those 180 passengers file lawsuits against you personally? His breathing had turned shallow, his fists clenching on the table. This story isn't going away, Olivia said. And neither am I. Crinkles snapped. He shoved the folder aside and slammed a fist on the table. You self-righteous. Careful, Olivia interrupted smoothly. You wouldn't want to say something that could be used against you later. One of the lawyers subtly reached for Reynolds' arm, a silent warning. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. You just ended your own career, Carter. Olivia tilted her head. Maybe, she admitted. Then she smiled. But I'll sleep just fine knowing I saved lives. Reynolds sat back, seething. He picked up the severance package folder, flicked through it with disinterest, then let it drop onto the table with a dull thud. Keep your money, she said. And with that, she turned and walked out, never looking back. By the time Olivia stepped out of Atlantic Horizon's headquarters, the world was already watching the company burn. She barely made it to her car before her phone erupted with notifications, news alerts, missed calls, messages from numbers she didn't recognize. The headlines had gone from scandalous to catastrophic. Lawsuits pile up against Atlantic Horizon following explosive FAA investigation. Passengers of flight AH-407 speak out. We could have died. Former employees reveal company's culture of corruption and cover-up. What had started as a corporate scandal had now spiraled into a national outrage. Every major news station was running the story, with passengers from past flights stepping forward, recounting eerily similar experiences. Emergency landings, unexplained malfunctions, maintenance concerns brushed aside. Some were filing lawsuits individually. Others were joining a massive class action case that threatened to cripple the airline permanently. Reynolds had underestimated her, badly. The company tried to control the damage. Atlantic Horizon's PR team scrambled to issue a vague, non-committal statement, claiming they were fully cooperating with the FAA and committed to upholding the highest safety standards. But it was too late. The FAA didn't just investigate, they acted. 3 days after Olivia's final confrontation with Reynolds, the Federal Aviation Administration made its announcement. Effective immediately, Atlantic Horizon's operating certificate was revoked. The airline was grounded. Permanently. It was unprecedented. Airlines had been fined before, sanctioned, forced to pay settlements. But a complete shutdown? That was unheard of. But this wasn't just a few policy violations. This was systemic fraud, deliberate safety violations, and a criminal level of negligence. The kind of thing that killed people. The kind of thing that, if Olivia hadn't exposed it, would have eventually cost hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. And Reynolds? Fired, publicly disgraced. His name was dragged through every news cycle, his past actions scrutinized, his involvement in covering up safety violations exposed. He tried to disappear, but the lawsuits kept coming. Families of past crash victims started demanding reinvestigations. Weston didn't fare any better. A leaked recording of his racist comments about pilots of color went viral, and he was swiftly removed from the industry. No airline would touch him. He had spent his entire career keeping people like Olivia out of the cockpit. And now, he'd never sit in one again. But it wasn't just Atlantic Horizon that was affected. Other airlines took notice. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The industry panicked. Corporate executives called emergency meetings. Policies were re-examined. Maintenance procedures were audited. Pilots and flight crews who had been ignored for years finally had a voice. Whistleblower hotlines were established. Aviation boards began reassessing diversity hiring practices, ensuring qualified candidates weren't being shut out simply because they didn't fit the mold of what a pilot was supposed to look like. Olivia had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The change had started, and it was just the beginning. The engines hummed beneath her fingertips, a deep, steady vibration that felt more like a heartbeat than machinery. Olivia sat in the left seat of the cockpit, her hands resting on the throttles, the familiar scent of jet fuel and pressurized air filling the cabin. The Atlantic Horizon nightmare was behind her, but the scars it left, on her reputation, on the industry, on the passengers who had trusted that airline with their lives, still lingered. And yet, despite everything, here she was, where she was always meant to be. Flying. The uniform was different now. Instead of Atlantic Horizon's navy and silver, she wore the crisp white and deep blue of Skyline Airways, one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. After the collapse of her former employer, multiple airlines had rushed to distance themselves from the scandal, eager to prove they were different, safer, more ethical. Some had quietly reached out to her, offering positions to the woman who had taken down one of their competitors. But Skyline hadn't reached out in secret. They had publicly announced her hiring, stating in no uncertain terms that her actions had made the industry safer, and that they wanted pilots who put integrity above corporate loyalty. And now, for the first time in months, she was back where she belonged. Pre-flight checklist complete, a voice said beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned and met the bright, eager eyes of Ashley Williams, her first officer. Young, sharp, the kind of pilot Olivia had been at her age. Hungry, determined, but carrying the weight of knowing she had to be twice as good, just to be seen as competent. Ashley shifted slightly in her seat, hesitating before speaking again. "Captain Carter." She glanced at the control panel, then back at Olivia. "I just wanted to say, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Olivia studied her for a moment, taking in the weight of those words. She had spent so much time fighting for respect, for safety, for her career, that she hadn't stopped to consider who might have been watching, who might have seen her stand her ground and realized they could too. She wrapped her hands around the yoke, feeling the smooth leather grip, the symbol of control, of power, of possibility. A slow smile spread across her face as she glanced out at the runway stretching before them. "The sky belongs to all of us," she said simply. "Never forget that." And with that, she pushed the throttles forward, the engines roaring to life, and together, they took off into the endless blue. The impact of Olivia's fight didn't stop with Atlantic Horizon's collapse. It rippled outward, forcing an industry that had spent decades resisting change to finally confront its own failures. For the first time in history, The FAA launched a comprehensive overhaul of hiring practices and safety regulations, ensuring that airlines could no longer prioritize profits over human lives without consequences. The agency issued new mandates, requiring third-party audits of maintenance procedures, stricter reporting systems for whistleblowers, and severe penalties for falsifying safety records. Airlines across the country scrambled to comply, terrified of becoming the next Atlantic Horizon. But it wasn't just about safety. Olivia's story had ignited a cultural shift. Diversity in aviation had always been a battle fought in silence, with qualified pilots and engineers shut out of opportunities, simply because they didn't fit the outdated image of what a leader in the cockpit was supposed to look like. But now the industry couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Applications from women and minority pilots surged. Flight schools reported record-high enrollments from underrepresented groups, young cadets inspired by the woman who had refused to be pushed aside. Airlines, under mounting public pressure, revised their hiring policies, implementing blind recruitment processes that focus solely on qualifications rather than background or gender. Some even introduced leadership programs specifically designed to elevate diverse voices in aviation. Olivia didn't set out to be a symbol. She had only wanted to do her job, to fly, to ensure the safety of her passengers, to hold those in power accountable. But whether she had intended it or not, she had become a force of change. The invitation came a few months later, a formal letter from the FAA delivered straight to her door. Captain Olivia Carter, in recognition of your contributions to aviation safety and your unwavering commitment to integrity in this industry, we would like to formally invite you to serve on the newly established FAA Aviation Safety Oversight Committee. Your insights and experience will be invaluable in shaping the future of airline regulations and ensuring that safety is never compromised again. She read it twice, then a third time. She had spent her entire career fighting to be heard. Now, they were asking her to help write the rules. The industry was changing, slowly, painfully but undeniably, and now she had the chance to make sure it never went back. The camera fades in on the skyline, jets cutting through the clouds as the sun glows golden against the horizon. The world of aviation had always seemed untouchable, ruled by traditions built over decades, resistant to change, guarded by those who believed power belonged to them alone. But one woman had proven otherwise. On-screen text appears, bold and undeniable. Olivia Carter didn't just take down a corrupt airline, she changed the aviation industry forever. The scene shifts to flashes of news reports, headlines scrolling across the screen. FAA reforms, diversity in hiring, whistleblower protections being strengthened. The faces of young cadets stepping into flight school, inspired by the woman who refused to back down. A slow fade brings us back to Olivia, standing at the edge of a runway, watching as a plane takes off into the endless sky. The roar of the engines fills the silence, and for a moment, the world holds still. Then a final voiceover cuts through. Would you have the courage to stand up when the world tells you to sit down? Tell us in the comments below. The screen fades to black. The roar of the departing jet lingers for a moment before fading into the vast expanse of sky. The world is quieter now, but its foundation has shifted. The industry that once thrived on silence had been forced to listen. The cracks Olivia exposed in Atlantic Horizon weren't just flaws in one company. They were symptoms of a system that had prioritized power over accountability for too long. But change had a way of spreading. The truth had a way of demanding to be heard. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing up despite it, knowing the cost, knowing the fight won't be easy, but refusing to let that stop you. Olivia hadn't set out to dismantle an empire. She had only wanted to do her job, to fly, to protect those who placed their lives in her hands. But when the moment came, when they told her to sit down, she stood anyway. And because of that, everything changed. One person's voice had brought down a corrupt airline. One person's defiance had forced the industry to evolve. One person's courage had given others the strength to believe that they too belonged in spaces they had been told weren't meant for them. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. Never let the weight of tradition convince you that progress is impossible. Never be afraid to demand better, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to fight back to bring an entire system to its knees. If you believe in truth, in fairness, in justice, don't let this conversation end here. Share this story. Speak up. Stay informed. And never stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. Truly, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate every single one of you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this journey. Your time is valuable, and the fact that you choose to spend it here means more than I can express. I have the utmost respect for each and every one of you. If you want to hear more real stories that expose the truth, like, comment, and subscribe, because the more we know, the harder it is to look away. See you in the next one. She stepped onto the aircraft, scanning the cockpit.